Hello, this is my lecture for, it's essentially the second half of Chapter 10 and Chapter 11, and the theme of these chapters for the most part has been democratization. The lecture we watched in class had to do with political democratization and the rise of Andrew Jackson, who was kind of like the poster child of democracy, or the style of democracy in any case. The next part is more social in nature. And all of these sort of democratic trends that we see represented in politics, things like a focus on the common man, a spurning of expert knowledge, all of those types of things have their own sort of counterparts in the society and social interactions and in social development. One example of this is a rise in popular religion with the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening that we had was a kind of revolt against the sort of more traditional old world style religion, and it happened during colonial times. The First Great Awakening tended to focus more on the fire and brimstone, sinners in the hands of an angry God type rhetoric, if you like. The Second Great Awakening was much more positive than the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening much more sort of televangelist, Joel, see if you like, kind of positivity, as opposed to the first, which was much more intent on kind of scaring people into proper behavior. This also had its origins in an area which is known as the Burned Over District, which is up in sort of western New York and places like that. It's where the First Great Awakening had its biggest or its greatest popularity as well. The Second Great Awakening, however, also very popular in states of the Upper South, places like Kentucky and Tennessee, those sort of western states. And a lot of the practice of it in those western states affected the way the religion looked. A big feature of this were camp meetings that would last for 2 or 3 days, and they were usually outdoors. You had thousands of people attend. They often included physical exercises that were intended to strengthen your faith, or to have a display, I suppose, of the strength of your faith, sort of faith, rather, a physical manifestation of the strength of your faith. Also, with the Second Great Awakening, you had a number of new denominations that become popular. The First Great Awakening were essentially dominated by people within the same old denominations, Presbyterians and Anglicans, but they had new ideas, and so you had the old traditional groups, the new old sides or the old lights, and then you had the new sort of reform groups, the new sides or the new lights. But these were both within the same denomination. They were still Presbyterians or they were still Anglicans. You have entirely new denominations coming out of the Second Great Awakening. The Methodists, for example, Baptists, and other groups like that find their start during this period. You also have during this period, which fits very well with the idea of democratization, is a theology that was known as theological perfectionism, the idea that people could work to perfect themselves and to perfect their behavior, and that perfection was actually within people's reach, which is the complete opposite of what the First Great Awakening argued with its sort of fire and brimstone, and we are all sinners and you have to ask for forgiveness because there's no way you're going to fix that sort of a message. You also have new groups that come out. Not the more, I suppose, mainstream new denominations like Methodists or Baptists, but more not mainstream. I can't think of the word that's not mainstream. Groups that come into existence in this period. Groups like the Shakers, which sort of practiced a communal style living. Groups like the Mormons, who had almost an entirely different perspective on traditional Christian theology. They have an entirely different book that tells an entirely different story of Jesus and how he came to America. So all of these groups were able to find some sort of niche in this era of American history, where there's a lot of focus on democratization. You also, of course, have a reactionary movement from the Unitarians, who were probably an early or a form of agnostic, I think is probably the best way to put it. They weren't really convinced by all of these revivals and other charismatic practices that were coming out of the Second Great Awakening. They were a little bit more skeptical than that. I wouldn't go so far as to say they were absolutely non-believers. I'm sure some of them were. But they were just skeptical of these new practices that were coming out. Along with this as well, you also get reform movements starting in this period. And at least part of it fits with this idea of democratization. Some of it can be connected to the religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening. Others of it can be connected to actual ideals of liberty and equality that go hand in hand as traditional democratic rhetoric. Things like the temperance movement, probably closer related to the new religious revivals going on. The American people prior to this were very heavy drinkers. On average, the adult male in 1825 drank about 7 gallons of liquor, most of that whiskey or hard cider, so pretty potent stuff. Compare that to nowadays, where the average American male only drinks about 2 gallons a year, and that's usually wine and beer as opposed to hard liquor. So it was definitely a problem, and it had its associated problems as well. Things like domestic violence, low productivity at work, which was becoming increasingly concerning as the U.S. becomes more and more focused on manufacturing as opposed to agriculture. Other reform movements included public school reform, which was essentially a way to kind of instill democratic principles and industrial principles in students as well. They had a lot of focus on things like punctuality and other things that become important in a industrial-based society. Movements that you could argue stem directly from the sort of democratic rhetoric are things like abolition, which of course argued for not only in some cases the emancipation of slaves, but also the inclusion of them in American society. The most extreme of these was a New Englander by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. And he believed not only in emancipation, but also in political as well as economic equality amongst former slaves and American citizens, or older American citizens, I suppose you could say. Now, he was something of a niche. He was not indicative of the entire abolition movement. Quite a lot of people would have been very happy to emancipate the slaves, but to keep them sort of permanently as second-class citizens, because there were very few people who actually felt that Africans were at all equal to their white counterparts. And so they didn't see the need to include them in this sort of democratic distribution of rights and privileges. As the end of the other lecture stated, it was almost as if one group gaining rights meant that another group had to lose them at the same time, because rights were a finite resource rather than an infinite one. Out of the abolition movement, you also have significant movement on behalf of women. A lot of early advocates in the women's movement started out as abolitionists, people like Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They undertook a sort of anti-slavery lecture tour, which was relatively popular, but they attempted to attend a world convention on abolition, but were turned away because they were women. And these experiences led them to expand their fight, not only for abolition and for equality amongst the races, African Americans and white Americans, but also for the sexes, between women and men, because they were still discriminated against as women in the abolition movement. The early women's movement is sort of climaxed, or you kind of the climax of that early movement, in the release of the Declaration of Sentiments, which, if you care to read it, it's very short. You can find it in your textbook on page 322 and 323. And the Declaration of Sentiments was intended to very closely mirror the Declaration of Independence. It starts out, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such course. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they go on, and they list in the same fashion as the Declaration of Independence, they have a sort of more philosophical entry, which part of I just read, and then they have a list of actual grievances that were committed by men against women. The early women's rights movement didn't really achieve any kind of actual legal aims as far as that went. Women were still not allowed to vote. But the Civil War kind of helped to change that. Because during the Civil War, a lot of the men went off to war, and women were left to tend to businesses and to farms and things like that. And they were taking on a lot more responsibility, so that you start to get more movement after the Civil War, although it would be another 50 or so years, even after the Civil War, before women would get any noticeable legal movement in the right direction, which is, of course, the passage of the 19th Amendment. Important to note, though, that there was a drafted 16th Amendment at the time of Reconstruction, which would have given women the vote, but it never went up before Congress to be voted on, which is a real shame. You also have movement for penitentiary reform and for asylum reform, and a lot of that had to do with this, again, movement towards democratization. The idea of a penitentiary was that you would go into it and you would be penitent. You would be sorry for the crime you committed. You would then be rehabilitated and then able to be let back out into society. And the idea that problems in human behavior could somehow be fixed was something that goes along with this whole democratization idea. But it's not just politics and reform where we see democratization happening. You also get it in just everyday life. Technology is starting to take off. And with it, you have new modern conveniences. Cities are growing, and cities are sort of the place for democratic entertainments and other type things to take hold. You have vast improvements in transportation. The railroads start to make an appearance early on, although early railroads in the U.S. had a number of problems that had to be overcome before they could be properly used. But it makes it easier for people to move around. In a way, it makes the United States smaller because people can travel around it so much easier than they could before. You also have a big boom in canal building, which makes it easier to move goods from one place to another. And all of this leads to an increase in the quality of life for average Americans. Their quality of houses went up. Where they would build the sort of brick row houses where they were all the same down one street. And eventually these brick row houses get subdivided and become tenement houses, which are the sort of bane of the immigrant city post-Civil War. But in this period, they are the sort of havens of the middle class and the working middle class professionals and so on in the big cities. Eventually they move out and go to the suburbs, and that's when the brick row houses become tenements. But all of this reveals the sort of rise in American prosperity. You have new modern conveniences, like you've said. Very few people, or not very few people, but a reduced number of people are able to grow their own vegetables or keep livestock, especially if they live in the cities. And so you have markets where they'll have to actually buy those goods. You also have new urban waterworks, which makes it much easier to gain access to fresh water in your houses. You have stoves, which make cooking a lot easier. You could actually cook multiple dishes at the same time instead of cooking over an open fire, as was most popular. All of these, of course, are not without their drawbacks. The stoves could be faulty, and you actually see a rise in carbon monoxide poisons and problems. The waterworks don't always work, and there is still a general problem with sanitation. Another downside to this, because people are traveling more, you also get a rise in epidemics, which is essentially the democratization of disease. And part of the problem is that doctors at the time, with the medicine that they had, didn't know how to effectively deal with these epidemics, which led to a kind of movement to democratize medicine itself. You start to get the suggestion that doctors with their fancy Latin words and, diagnoses of diseases that people have never heard of, they're just trying to sort of take you in. They're essentially con artists trying to get your money for things you don't really need them for. And so there's a movement to say that you don't really need all that education to be a doctor. Anybody can be a doctor. And that kind of marks the downslide of the American medical profession until pretty much the turn of the 20th century. And we have a few wars where the medicine is abominable. And it really becomes obvious to us that perhaps you do need some specialized knowledge to be a doctor. Lawyers and ministers also had the same sort of problems with people essentially distrusting them and their so-called expert knowledge. Interestingly enough, at the same time that doctors are sort of going down in the estimation of people, surgeons are actually going up. And that's, surgeons had a bad rep for centuries almost. Usually because it was very painful to have surgery, because there was nothing to dull the pain. You just had to sort of deal with it. So anybody who's cutting into you and causing you untold amounts of pain was obviously not going to be high on your list of favorite people. However, anesthesia gets introduced, essentially nitrous oxide, laughing gas, gets introduced in this period, which makes the surgeons sort of come out of the PR race a lot better than doctors. Along with this sort of movement away from expert medical knowledge, you start to get your sort of quack medical things. And we have examples of this now. You have magic diet pills and diets themselves and other things like that. And these kind of fads were just as popular back then. Probably one of the most notable was begun by a man called Sylvester Graham, and he advocated for a very disciplined style of health. He urged Americans to eat vegetables and fruits and whole grains. The whole grains he provided himself, he originally called them graham bread. Today we call them graham crackers. He also advised Americans to abstain from eating meat, spices, coffee, tea, alcohol, and to limit the amount of sex that they had as well. So obviously a very fun program to be on. Graham crackers are the only part of that really survived, and they're not necessarily considered a health food anymore. Another popular pseudoscience of the period was known as phrenology, and it was the idea that certain regions on the head represented certain physical characteristics. So if you had a really large forehead or frontal lobe or something, then that corresponded to some sort of character trait that you had as a person. And the idea was that you could look at someone's head, you could look at the shape of their head and where all the dips and bumps and stuff were, although this would probably be really difficult if you had any kind of hair. But you could look at that person really quickly at a glance and be able to sort of measure their character from the way that their head looked. This practice was called phrenology. And it kind of fits with this idea. American life is becoming much faster, much more demanding. And the idea that you can measure someone up with, a glance is attractive to a lot of people. But it wasn't just health fads and transportation, modern conveniences. Pastimes became more democratic as well. The theater was probably one of the most popular things, and the theater really represented a place where every level of society could mix and mingle. You would have your more high-paying customers in the boxes. You would have working class people on the floor. You would have working girls on the floor or in the boxes as well, plying their trade at the theater. You would have people selling food and selling drinks. And it was almost like the popularity of the actors also triggered kind of competitiveness amongst fans, sort of like a early 19th century Team Edward, Team Jacob type thing, where they would get, fans had very loyal, or actors rather, had very loyal followings, and sometimes rival fans would even get in fights and things like that at theaters. The actually most popular playwright during this period was William Shakespeare, when in 1835, 65 performances of Shakespeare happened in just that year alone. Oftentimes as well, you would have Shakespeare plays that were adapted. So sort of like how She's the Man is an adaptation of Twelfth Night from Shakespeare. They would do their own sort of adaptations like that, where they would write plays that were essentially followed the same storyline, the same plot, but had changes in characters, and it was modified to an 1830s audience. This wasn't the only theatrical production that you could watch. Minstrel shows were also very popular. They usually had sort of skit-type performances. So they would have dancing, and they would have singing and humorous sketches, a lot of times making fun of political conflict, and so you'd have a lot of political satire and things like that involved in the minstrel shows. These were the sort of early precursors to vaudeville, which was really popular back later in the early 20th century. Another popular entertainment were sort of circuses or freak shows, and an early precursor to this was introduced by a man called P.T. Barnum, who eventually became, or eventually had a circus that traveled around, but he set up his American Museum, which was essentially a freak show, sort of like Ripley's Believe It or Not, essentially. One of his more famous acts was General Tom Thumb, and there's actually a picture of Tom Thumb on page 347 in your textbook, posing there with P.T. Barnum. He was a little person, I believe is the correct term now. Barnum was really good at harnessing public opinion and using the rather new and growing mass media to get people to attend his shows. So he would write an article or something talking about an exhibit at his museum, and people would go and see it because it would drum up interest. And then he might put an article in the newspaper once that sort of flow eased off, questioning the authenticity of the exhibit. And so then people would buy a whole new round of tickets to go and try and see that it was fake. And he was a very clever marketer in that way. You also see, sort of as a result of this, an interest in Americanizing art and literature. And so you have what's referred to as a sort of American Renaissance in the arts. In literature, it's led by people like Nathaniel Hawthorne or James Fillmore Cooper or Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And you get an American style of literature that's fairly exclusive to America. The whole period in world literature is referred to as Romanticism, and you have sort of European contributions to Romanticism as well as American ones. But you have a distinctly American version of that, which is called Transcendentalism, and that's defined by writers like Emerson and Thoreau. And it was a kind of sort of New Age spiritual type movement, connection between man and nature, and those sorts of things. It was a very American movement. You get these same kind of things with art, where you have American Romanticism in art. Romanticism tended to portray the world as if looking through rose-colored glasses, or so the saying goes. In paintings, you have an excellent example is the rather famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which was painted during this period, and it's a pretty cliche romantic painting. It shows, it's very unrealistic, first off, in the way that it's set up, but it also gives a kind of epic feel to things, or to the moment itself, to the event, and it makes it, it definitely makes the event feel much more eventful than perhaps it would have been in reality. So Romanticism usually has an element of unreality about it. Oftentimes American Romanticism also involves landscape painting and things like that. So you see grand pictures of mountains and trees and canyons and waterfalls and rivers and things like that, but they're all on a kind of larger than life scale. You also have a fair amount of emphasis on Native American culture, sort of romanticizing Native American culture as well. You usually have very obvious symbolism as darkness versus light on the pictures, and you can sort of see, if you look at some of these images, if you were to look up American Romanticism in art, then you can see that a lot of the movement of the pictures goes from light, or from dark to light, rather, and the West gets very idealized treatment in that sense as well. All of these things find a much better market in that the marketplace for literature grows massively. You have interest in dime novels, or essentially short paperback novels that people would write for money. You also have magazines that are serializing stories in order to make them more accessible to people. You have sort of sensationalist newspapers starting to come out and everything as well. And all of this helps to open up the publishing business and the publishing arena for everyone. And so that's kind of how democratization was affecting society generally as well. I hope this gives you a good general overview of how society became democratized, both politically, as we discussed in class, and socially, as I've just discussed here. So thank you.